So the new edition, the first edition came out in 1997. This is it here, and it ended pretty much with Schindler's List and the starting of DreamWorks, which happened around the same time. DreamWorks happened in '94, Schindler's List in '93, and so I brought this book up to date, and people have been saying for years, gee, you know, it'd be nice if you could update the book. So I finally did it, and it was quite a job because he's done a heck of a lot since 1997. He's been involved with literally hundreds of films. As you know, he has that studio, DreamWorks, which has had a lot of ups and downs, and is now part of Disney. They were trying to make it go on their own, but it's really hard to start a complete studio independently, so they sold it to Paramount, and then they were not happy there, so they moved to Disney, and it's kind of a boutique. It's not really a full studio anymore. It's sort of a boutique operation, but they still produce films that Spielberg doesn't direct. So I tried to see as many of the films that he produced as possible, and write about the history of the company at the same time as I was following his fortunes as a director. And what I wanted to find out, you know, when you write a book, it's good to have a theme and a thesis. And the challenge for me in this new edition that I wanted to solve for myself was, I wasn't particularly thrilled that he started a company, because I just prefer to have him directing films because I'm a Spielberg admirer, you know. So I thought, gee, why does he have to distract himself by making all these other films that are, a lot of them not too good. Some are really terrible, like the Transformers films, and I thought it would maybe take away from his directing career. But actually what I found out was it didn't really hurt his directing career, that he's made about the same number of films since '97 proportionally that he did before that as a director, you know, in terms of the number of films per year. And the quality of his recent films is very high, I think. I'm a big fan of Amistad and AI, Minority Report. The Terminal, I think, is a very good, kind of underrated film. He's made a couple of not so good films in that period, but his quality is quite good. And so I think what he's done with his company is my conclusion is that he enjoys being a mogul. He's not doing it for the money, because he has all the money that anybody could ever spend, but he's doing it to have a certain freedom in the Hollywood system. That if you produce a film like Transformers, as awful as it is, makes hundreds of millions of dollars, it pays for a film like Amistad that doesn't do very well at the box office, but that he really wants to do. And if he weren't producing these films, maybe he would have a hard time getting the money, if he were just a director, to make Amistad or Lincoln, which is another film he's working on.
So now he has this kind of like double persona, like an independent artistic persona and like a business blockbuster persona. So
yeah, he called himself, could I borrow the book for a second? There's
yes.
a phrase I just wanted to get here, if you could just want to get the right quote from him. He has a good description of himself as mainstream independent. That's right. He calls himself a mainstream independent, which is a kind of a paradox. And it's an interesting position to be in. He's independent up to a point. Nobody can be completely independent and work in the Hollywood system because there's so much money involved, unless you were... The only guy who ever was completely independent, I think, was Charlie Chaplin. That's because he was the most popular star in the world, and he had, you know, unlimited money to spend. So he actually owned his own studio and financed his own films, and he had nothing to do with the studios except United Artists, which he partly owned. But Spielberg, even though he has $3 billion, I guess, you know, he could make the films on his own with his own money. But John Ford, when Spielberg was 16, he met John Ford, who gave him some advice. He said, never spend your own money on your own films, and that's an old Hollywood saying. Recently he started to do that because to keep DreamWorks going he had to spend some money, some of his own millions, but for whatever reason he's not willing to just go out and write a check for $50 million to make Lincoln. He gets funding from banks and studios, you know, but he's independent within that system. He gets final cut, and he gets a very large percentage of the gross. So as much as anybody has creative freedom, he does. But you don't just get that by demanding it. You have to earn it, and you have to keep being popular enough to justify it. You know, people, no matter how popular you are, if you start making some films that don't make as much money, you're going to lose your control. And he's made a few films that have flopped, and I mean, Amistad probably made a profit, but it didn't make much money, you know. So he also likes to alternate kind of very serious films with very popular films. So he'll make an Indiana Jones sequel, and then he'll make Lincoln, and it sort of goes back and forth between the two, which I think is good. But I think he likes, you know, he really values his independence, but he wants to do the kind of films that Hollywood does. He's not a guy who makes little avant-garde independent films. He likes big films on the big scale. And John Ford was a little like that. I think Spielberg is kind of in the tradition of Ford and Capra. They were very popular artists who worked within the system. Although Ford was, he was sort of independent up to a point. He was very independent-minded and got his way a lot, but he also worked for studios, and, you know, he didn't own his films, and they would recut them sometimes. And so he had kind of a struggle sometimes with the studios, but quite often got his way. And Capra was very strong at Columbia Pictures in the 30s because he was very popular. So he had a lot of control, but he still had a boss, and he didn't have complete control, and sometimes they'd recut his films, and then later he had trouble getting films financed. And Orson Welles was completely different because he really was an independent filmmaker who occasionally worked within the system, and the system didn't really like him. They didn't like his kind of films because he's a really avant-garde filmmaker. So he's a completely different kind of character, you know. He later became a totally independent filmmaker, making films with his own money, like the one I'm in. So that's kind of a different study. But Spielberg is, you know, the most successful director of all time, and has a lot of autonomy, which he values a lot. So that's part of what I'm dealing with, is how do you function as a serious artist in a commercial system and still be the world's most popular filmmaker. It's quite a balancing act, you know. And one thing I'll add to that is another thing I found about his later films. Part of the theme of my book was that he was this Jewish kid who was often treated as an outsider because his family lived in largely Gentile neighborhoods when he was growing up, and sometimes he was mistreated by kids because he was Jewish. And some people would become a rebel and angry, revolutionary kind of guy, but he wanted acceptance, so he tried to make friends and convert people who didn't like him or didn't like Jews or whatever into liking him. And the way to do that was to make films that they enjoyed. So he had kids, like there was a bully who mistreated him in grade school, so he put him in one of his World War II movies playing a Nazi, so he could order this kid around who was bigger than him and everything, and maybe humiliate the kid a little bit, you know. So I thought that was a wonderful way to cope with your problems, is to make people respect you and like you. So that's the root of him being a popular artist. He wanted the audience to love him and accept him. But now he's had so much love and acceptance, he's won Academy Awards and things, and his films made so much money that I think he's moved beyond that. And the period I write about now is a kind of a time in which he's sort of turned his back a little bit on the audience, and he's making films sometimes just to please himself, or films that he feels he needs to make, like Munich, which was, I think is a very good, serious film, not calculated to be a hit, and also a film that he knew would cause a lot of people to get angry. He wasn't doing it to be popular, but he felt he needed to do it, you know.